This is Series 4, Session 6, Faith, Culture, and Society. Today's topic is Laura Ingalls Wilder. Laura Ingalls Wilder lived from almost 100 years, 90 years, from 1867 to 1957. She was a children's author. And today we want to consider the series of books that she wrote, the Little House series, as it's known, for young people. And she wrote these books to relate experiences and challenges of pioneer families as they moved across westward in America in the 1880s, the 1890s, the end of the 19th century. She wrote 8 books in all, and they're based on true events and true people that she knew. In the stories, we see the fingerprint of God. The stories are real things that happened to her, and the writing reveals struggles and challenges of moving westward and settling the frontier, the interior of the United States. What makes a good author? What makes a good book? I think that a good book appeals to all ages of people, both young people and adults. A quality book will reflect reality and truth, and in it, principles are woven through the story. For instance, the characters of a good book are complex. They're true to life people. They're not simple. They are not superficial. They're not just two-dimensional. They're complex. And in writing these stories from the true events of her life, we can see that people that she met on the prairie, people who were going through struggles, people who were moving westward, they had left everything behind, they were moving westward into new areas of the country, leaving behind their past, looking forward to the future, to settling in a place where they had never been before, clearing trees, plowing the land, planting crops, growing their families, founding towns, churches, and schools. You know, this westward movement of the late 1800s in America really started at the very founding of America with the 13 colonies. And we see that even the early colonists pushed westward. There was always a frontier area, and there were new opportunities and challenges. So in her writing, the internal qualities of the characters exemplify high ideals. In her characters, we see courage, we see reverence, we see a respect for others. And in a sense, Americans moving westward were seeking freedom and opportunities to grow, to start businesses, to start schools, to exercise liberty. Many historians have said that the frontier and settlers moving westward powerfully shaped America. And people moving westward who were finding a new life. They were leaving the past behind and forging ahead. Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote this series of books on account of her own family moving into Wisconsin from New York. The western lands were opened up to settlers, and her mother and her father packed up, put all they owned in a wagon, and moved westward from New York into Wisconsin, about a 1,000-mile trip. Why did she write these books? Well, in her own words, in letters that she wrote, this is what she said. The Little House books are stories of long ago. Today, our way of living and our schools are much different. So many things have made living and learning easier, but the real things haven't changed. It is still best to be honest and truthful, to make the most of what we have, to be happy with simple pleasures, be cheerful, to have courage when things go wrong. Great improvements in living have been made because every American has always been free to pursue his happiness. And as long as Americans are free, they will continue to make our country ever more wonderful, unquote. So in these books, we read a true account of her life as her family moves westward. Her father, Charles Ingalls, was born in New York. He moved west to Illinois when he was 12 years old with his family. Again, in 7 more years, at age 19, he moved to Wisconsin. And there he fell in love. He met a woman, Carolyn, and he marries her. Here in Wisconsin, this is where Laura and her 2 sisters are born. And here is the setting for the very first book of her series. She writes of her life much later, really, in the 1930s. She's looking back and she writes this first book, The Little House in the Big Woods. 10 years later, the family moves on to Minnesota, further west. In another book, On the Bank of the Plum Creek, her second book of the series, we learn about their life there in Minnesota. Later, the family moves on to Kansas, further west, and on to South Dakota. And in South Dakota, they are one of the founding families for the Smet, a small town that's just becoming established. Charles Ingalls works for the railroad being built westward, and they enter into town life. Here in DeSmet, they experience a real hard winter with a number of blizzards. I'm going to read a portion of her book from The Long Winter. So this is her third book. She writes, at that moment, the clock struck 11 times. My goodness, the dinner, Ma exclaimed. She hurried into the kitchen to stir up the fire and season the bean soup. Better put more coal in the heater, Laura, she called. Seems like the house hasn't warmed up like it should have. It was noon when Pa came in. He came in quietly and he went to the heater where he took off his coat and cap. Hang these up for me, will you, Laura? I'm pretty cold. I'm sorry, Charles, Ma said from the kitchen. I can't seem to get the house warm. No wonder, Pa answered. It's 40 degrees below zero, and this wind is driving the cold in. This is the worst storm yet, but luckily everyone is accounted for. Nobody's lost from town. After dinner, Pa played hymn tunes on his fiddle, and all afternoon they sang. There's a land that is fairer than day, and by faith we can see it afar. And they sang, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a weary land, a weary land. Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a shelter in the time of storm. They sang Ma's favorite song, There is a happy land far, far away. And before Paul laid aside the fiddle in its box, the time had come when he must go to the stable and take care of the stock. So he played a gallant, challenging tune that brought them all to their feet, and they sang lustily, Then let the hurricane soar, we will soon be o'er. We'll weather the blast and land at last on Canaan's happy shore. The blizzard was roaring, ice and snow as hard as buckshot and fine as sand were swirling. The next day, the blizzard was over, and Ma said it was only a 2-day blizzard. You can never tell what a blizzard will do, Pa agreed. So we learn about Laura's life. We learn about her family. And what did they do in a challenging situation? We see how they faced difficulty. They faced it as a family, encouraging one another, supporting, serving one another. And they faced the storm with hymns, relying on God. Here we see the fingerprint of God in Laura's life. She writes 8 books that help us enter into life long ago. Laura once said, quote, "The past can educate, it can entertain, and it can inspire new generations." These books and stories will be read a long time. Thanks for joining us for Faith, Culture, and Society.